I think when people watch 300, the key is to remember that this film adaptation is consistent with a long line of interpretation, whether it's novelists in the 19th century, or whether it's poets in the 17th or 16th or 12th century, or whether it's vase painters in the 4th or Herodotus in the 5th. Each person is trying to convey this wonderful event, a story of a few men that were willing to risk all for a larger Western concept of freedom and liberty.
To sacred Sparta, a king, our king, Leonidas! Ho, ho, ho!
You know, the storyteller knows how to not ruin a good story with the truth necessarily. You know, he knows how to exaggerate a moment for dramatic purposes. And because you have these young Spartans listening, you basically have the excuse of it's their version of the Battle of Thermopylae that you're seeing. Certainly that story was told thousands of times before it was ever written down. Herodotus wrote it down way after the fact, you know? It wasn't like he was there watching, you know, with a pen going, oh, geez, huh? Taking notes.
Here's what Herodotus said happened, and then here's Frank Miller's adaptation in modern context, and then here's the movie of Frank Miller's novel, derived from Herodotus, derived from Thermopylae.
This is the filter of Frank movie. You know, here's history, go through Frank, this is what you got.
I was walking around there, walking the hills and staring at the plaque and staring at this magnificent frieze and sculpture that was built by American Greeks. I felt transported. I didn't know it would hit me as emotionally hard as it did. But ever since I was a little boy, I'd been wanting to walk that land. The Spartans remain a mystery. They were completely a battle culture. They were absolutely dedicated to warfare. But at the same time, they had an absolute code of honor on what it meant to be Spartan. And it was cruel. It was very cruel. If a child was born sickly or deformed, the child was murdered. But out of this arose this heroic class that the world had never seen before.
These are people who, from the age 7, trained for nothing other than war.
All young boys were taken away from their mothers and put into a thing called the agoge. And the agoge was a system that tried to create the ultimate warrior. Everything the agoge did was geared towards turning these young boys into grown men who would fight and die for the city-state of Sparta.
In the movie, I've edited it into its most brutal aspects, but there were parts of the agoge that I think are also interesting, that to be the ultimate warrior, you had to learn music and dance and mathematics and philosophy. That combination created the ultimate warrior.
When they were in the agoge, they were taught to think, to be very witty and sharp. They used to have to sit with their tutors and have these kind of raps, you know, to see who could be funnier. And actually, they took those skills with them when they went into war. They used to walk into war singing and dancing. And the other warriors in the ancient world thought this was completely crazy.
In that process of training, all this myth-making surrounded the nature of the ordeal, that they were taught how to go out on their own barefooted, live off the land, steal their food. And again, the idea was that this was going to be a hyper-militaristic male initiation of a small coterie of exceptional warriors.
I came up with the story of the wolf as an allegory for the Hot Gates themselves. There's no historical evidence that he ever fought a wolf at all. I made it up out of whole cloth because I cheat. But I wanted to symbolize not only the structure of the Battle of Hot Gates, the way he traps the wolf in between walls of rock, but also to establish Leonidas as a legendary hero, rather than just as what was probably a much more practical man. But I've never been accused of realism. And I never deserved to be.
Well, I have to say, I don't think in the historical record we do know that there was anything particular that Leonidas did that allowed him to be king. I think he was king because it was his hereditary right that he was king. And in fact, what had happened is that his half-brother, his elder half-brother, had gone mad and had died cutting himself to pieces, which is how Leonidas inherited the throne. So it's a slightly less heroic version than the one that you'll find in the film.
But what's interesting about the film, I think, is that there are elements of truth in there. They had to go through this ritual where they ran through a sanctuary and they had to steal something from an altar. And as they ran through the sanctuary to try and steal this particular object from the altar, they were whipped with rods and with horse whips. And they had to do this about 50 times. So you can imagine the state that their bodies were in by the end of this exercise. So if Leonidas had to go through an operation like that and had come out alive, then of course he was somebody special. Leonidas was the king of Sparta, and his name means born of lion stock. So already when he was given his name at birth, a lot was expected of him. He was expected to be a great hero. And I'm sure that a connection was being made with Hercules, because the Spartans hero worshipped Hercules. They thought they were actually descended from the hero Hercules. And of course, Hercules slays lions. It's one of the things that he does. And so I wonder if by giving Leonidas the name, the descendant of lions, they're almost expecting Leonidas to be like a kind of superhero.
Leonidas was a very practical man who simply worshipped Sparta and wouldn't take the insult of letting what they called barbarians to overcome Greece. The shocking scene where Leonidas shoves the messengers into the well.
This is Sparta!
Is actually one that I kind of cheated on that, because that actually happened 10 years earlier with a different king. But to me, it was a great way to reveal that Spartans were different than the other Greeks. They lived by much more barbaric rules. It was blasphemy to kill a messenger, and to kill 30 of them was beyond blasphemy. But those were the Spartans.
I think what you've got to remember about the ancient world 2,500 years ago is that there was not a country called Greece with a capital, Athens, which is what we've got in our heads. There were these very distinct, very idiosyncratic city-states, lots of them, groups of people who really hated one another. So the Spartans really hated the Athenians, for instance. And at this time, 2,500 years ago, the really big deal are the Persians, this great big Persian empire that sits in the Eastern Mediterranean and glares out across at Greece. Xerxes is Leonidas's nemesis, is Leonidas's fate. Xerxes was the emperor, the ruler of the Persian Empire. And at this time, the Persian Empire occupied most of the known world. So it occupied the whole of the Middle East, parts of Pakistan and India. And Persia had Greece and the rest of Europe in its sights, which is why Xerxes decides to invade.
Xerxes regarded himself as God. He was revered as a god king, and he believed it was his destiny to conquer the world.
This was a man with quite some personality issues. Xerxes was an individual who had never been challenged in his life about anything. So when he and his father decide that they're going to invade Greece, that they're going to take over the rest of the world, then nobody puts their hands up and says, we don't think this is such a good idea.
To our king! There's nothing that can stop us now!
What you have in Sparta are two kings, and the kings are advised by 5 ephors. And these ephors generally are old men, and they tell the kings what it is that they think they should be doing for the good of the Spartan state. But the ephors were incredibly important to the Spartans, and I think it's interesting what Frank Miller's done with them in his comic book, because he's kind of got their essence. Everybody was always trying to work out what the ephors wanted the Spartans to do. They're always trying to second guess them. So the fact that in the comic book you've got these ephors as these kind of gnarled old guys who hold the future of the city-state in their twisted hand is a very good evocation of them.
Sparta wages no war at the time of the Carneia.
There's a question here, and that is, to what degree the Greeks themselves predicate their war-making on superstition or logic? And I think in the movie there's a little bit of that tension, that you have some ephors who represent a pre-logical or a pre-reasoned past.
Well, the ancient Greeks were all very, very religious, but the Spartans were double religious. The Spartans were incredibly superstitious, and the Spartan army would only move when a certain spirit called the Oracle told them they should go and fight. And the Oracle was a real person. She was a woman, and she lived in a temple, in Apollo's temple, in this place called Delphi, up in the north of Greece. And she was a very old woman, but she used to dress in virgins' clothes. And she'd sit over this fire, and on the fire would be sprinkled seeds of henbane or laurel, which are really really hallucinogenic. I mean, this is not something you should try at home, because if you burn them, you get really quite a high. So the oracle would sit over sniffing up this hallucinogenic smoke, and then she'd babble out stuff. And this is what the Spartans believed were messages from the spirit world.
Honor the carnage.
What happens in reality is that the oracle, this kind of crazy, spirited woman, tells the Spartans that they can only go and fight at Thermopylae if they're ready to suffer terrible losses and if their king is prepared to die.
It is not a question of what a Spartan citizen should do, nor a husband, nor a king. Instead, ask yourself, my dearest love, what should a free man do?
What I love about Leonidas is he is probably the most decisive character I've ever played. But in his moment of indecision, he needs backup. He needs a second opinion. He needs assurance. He looks both times to his wife.
Gorgo was, by all accounts, brilliant. And she and Leonidas had what I suspect was more a partnership than a marriage.
Gorgo's a great character. I mean, she's a great character, not just in the film, but in history. And we know quite a lot about her because this guy called Herodotus, who was the father of history, was so impressed by her stories that he chose to write about her, which tells us that she was significant. Spartan women were special anyway. They were always supposed to be incredibly beautiful. Homer tells us that Sparta was Sparta Calligeneika, the land of beautiful women. And Spartan women were beautiful because they were physically fit, because they were allowed to exercise, and also because they had a real sense of themselves. I mean, unusually in the ancient world, Spartan women were not repressed. They were considered incredibly potent.
What does a realist want with his queen?
What's certainly true is that Spartan women were really sexualized. They weren't afraid of using their sexuality as a weapon. Women, for instance, could choose who they slept with, which is really, really unusual in ancient society. And it was often said of Spartan women that they would do this in a political context, that they would sleep with men who they wanted to find out kind of political secrets from. So I think this is probably where the idea of Gorgo as using her sex for political purposes and to serve the state comes from.
We don't know to what degree a Spartan woman could prance into the assembly hall and announce to male voters who were, remember, the only citizens were male, that she was going to do this and this and that. But the idea of emancipated, strong women taking a part in politics is very Greek.
Queen Gorgo was a formidable politician. Spartan women were trained to battle just like the men. Had Persia marched directly on Sparta, the last line of defense probably would have been Spartan women who could fight very, very well.
Consider the fate of your women.
Clearly, you don't know our women. I might as well have marched them up here, judging by what I've seen.